The wreck should not have been there. That was the first thing Dr. Marcus Webb thought when the deep-range sonar came back with the image. Not wonder, not excitement, not the particular electric thrill that archaeologists talk about in interviews when they describe the moment of discovery. Just that simple, flat, almost offended certainty. The wreck should not have been there. He was sitting in the cramped sonar bay of the research vessel Meridian, 300 miles off the coast of what used to be called the Fertile Crescent, in waters that dropped 11,000 feet to a seabed that no human eye had ever seen and no submersible had ever seriously mapped. The Meridian was not a glamorous ship. It was small and underfunded and smelled permanently of diesel and instant coffee, and the sonar equipment was 2 generations behind what the big university programs used. Marcus had applied for better funding 6 times in 4 years and been turned down 6 times in 4 years, which was why he was out here with a 12-person crew and equipment that a well-funded graduate program would have considered embarrassing. None of that mattered right now. Right now, on the screen in front of him, something was sitting on the ocean floor 11,000 feet below the Meridian's keel, and it was the wrong shape. Not wrong like damaged, not wrong like a natural formation that the sonar was misreading, wrong like the human brain rejects something that violates its fundamental categories, the way you feel when you see a color that doesn't have a name. The shape on that screen was a vessel. Marcus had spent 23 years studying ancient maritime history, and he knew vessel shapes the way a musician knows chord progressions, instinctively and deep in the bones. This was a vessel. It was 800 feet long. He sat with that number for a moment. 800 feet. For context, a modern aircraft carrier was roughly 1,000 feet. The largest wooden ship ever confirmed by archaeological record was 430 feet, a Chinese treasure junk from the early 15th century, and that measurement was disputed by half the field. The oldest confirmed seagoing vessel ever found, a Bronze Age wreck off the coast of Turkey, was 58 feet long. 800 feet. He pulled up the sonar resolution and ran the enhancement software twice to make sure he wasn't looking at artifact data, compression errors, system noise. He ran a third pass. The image got clearer each time, not murkier, which was what you got with false readings. Clearer. 800 feet of vessel, sitting on the floor of the ocean, in water too deep for any salvage operation that had ever happened in this part of the world. Marcus Webb picked up his coffee mug, found it empty, put it back down and said very quietly to no one in particular, "That is not possible." Then he started making calls. The first call was to Dr. Yolanda Reyes at the University of Chicago, his oldest professional colleague and the person he trusted most in the field of ancient maritime archaeology. She picked up on the 4th ring, which meant she was in her office, which meant it was a good time. "Marcus," she said, "you sound weird." "I found something." A pause. Yolanda had known him for 18 years. She knew the difference between his "I found something" voice and his "I found something" voice. How big? 800 feet. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that he checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Marcus, I know. That's not. I know. The sonar could be. I ran 3 passes. It gets clearer. It's a vessel, Yolanda. It's got hull lines. It's got what looks like a superstructure amidships. I can see what might be deck fittings." He paused. "It's sitting upright. 11,000 feet down, and it's sitting upright on the seabed like it was parked there." Another silence, longer this time. "I'm going to need to see the data," she said. "I'm sending it now." He sent the sonar imaging files while they were still on the phone and listened to Yolanda's breathing change as she opened them. The slight hitch that meant she was seeing what he had seen. The quiet that meant she was running the same mental calculations he had run, the same rejections, the same reluctant arrivals at the same impossible conclusion. "Marcus," she said finally, very carefully, "how old are you reading the sediment layer at?" He had run the sediment analysis twice. The sediment layer over and around the vessel, the slow geological accumulation of millennia of ocean floor deposition, was consistent with a timeline of roughly 5,000 years. Give or take the margin of error inherent in this kind of reading, which was significant, but not significant enough to change the fundamental picture. 5,000 years, he said, give or take. 5,000 years ago, humans were building reed boats on the Euphrates. Yes, we weren't building 800-foot ocean-going vessels. No, Marcus agreed, we weren't. 3 weeks later, the Meridian had company. The research consortium that Yolanda had assembled with a speed that Marcus found both impressive and slightly alarming included 3 universities, 2 independent research foundations, a technology company that made underwater survey equipment and smelled an historic opportunity, and in a development that Marcus had mixed feelings about. A discreet but unmistakable presence from the United States Navy in the form of 2 vessels that parked themselves at a respectful but watchful distance and explained their presence as routine patrol activity in a way that convinced no one. The consortium had brought proper equipment, the kind Marcus had spent 4 years failing to get funding for: deep-rated submersibles, high-resolution multi-beam sonar arrays, remote-operated vehicle platforms that could hold position in the current at 11,000 feet, sample extraction systems, the full suite. The Meridian sat in the middle of all of it, looking like the scrappy underdog it was, and Marcus stood on its deck and watched the operation expanding around him, and tried to hold onto the feeling that this was still his discovery, his project, his thing to understand. He was largely failing at that, but he was trying. The first submersible dive was on a Tuesday morning, 5 weeks after Marcus had first seen that impossible shape on his sonar screen. He was in the control bay of the consortium's lead research vessel, the vastly better-equipped Athena, watching the camera feeds as the submersible descended through 11,000 feet of cold, dark water toward whatever was waiting at the bottom. The team was quiet around him. 15 researchers from 4 institutions, the kind of focused silence that settles over a group of scientists when they are about to see something they have been thinking about for weeks, when the theoretical is about to become actual. The submersible's lights cut through the dark, and the wreck came into view. Marcus heard someone behind him say, "Oh my God," in a voice that had absolutely no scientific distance in it whatsoever, and he understood completely, because his own reaction was not remotely scientific either. His chest had gone tight, and his hands were gripping the edge of the console, and the part of his brain that had spent 23 years building careful academic frameworks for understanding ancient human maritime history was simply offline, gone quiet, replaced by something much older and much simpler and much more honest. It was beautiful. Not the way ruins are usually beautiful, with the melancholy beauty of broken things, the poetry of decay. This was beautiful the way a living thing is beautiful, the way a predator in motion is beautiful, with a force and an intention that transcended age. The hull was intact, not partially intact, not preserved enough to make out the general form. Intact. 800 feet of vessel sitting on the ocean floor in water so cold and deep that the usual processes of deterioration had been dramatically slowed. Yes, but not enough, not nearly enough to account for what they were seeing. The hull material was wrong. That was the second thing Marcus noticed, pulling his attention up from the raw, overwhelming fact of the vessel's existence to the specific details his training told him to look for. The hull material was not wood. It was not any ancient construction material he had any framework for. It was dark, almost black, with a surface texture that the cameras rendered as slightly iridescent, and it showed, in the submersible's lights, absolutely no sign of the biological fouling and mineral incrustation that 11,000 feet of seawater over 5,000 years should have produced in abundance. The hull looked, and Marcus hated himself for the thought even as he had it new. Is anyone else seeing the hull material? Dr. Chen Wei from MIT, the materials specialist, was leaning forward at his station with an expression that Marcus recognized as the look of a scientist whose entire professional framework had just started asking uncomfortable questions of itself. We're all seeing it, Yolanda said quietly. She was standing beside Marcus, and he could feel the tension in her posture without looking at her. Chen, preliminary read. I can't preliminary read this, Chen said, which from a man who had published 40 papers on ancient construction materials and was professionally allergic to uncertainty, was a statement of considerable significance. I need samples. I can't even the surface reflectivity alone is outside anything in my database. Whatever that material is, it is not anything that a human civilization was producing 5,000 years ago. He paused. It is not anything that a human civilization is producing now. The control bay went very quiet. Marcus heard the Navy liaison, a Commander Torres who had been introduced as an observer, and had been observing with an intensity that went well beyond scientific curiosity, make a quiet sound beside him that was not quite a word, and not quite not a word. Let's not jump to conclusions, Marcus said, because someone had to say it and he was the project lead, and that was his job. There are 100 possible explanations we haven't ruled out. Unknown human civilization, lost technology, advanced Bronze Age metallurgy we have no other record of. Marcus, Yolanda said. Her voice had a quality he recognized. The quality of someone who has seen something and is deciding whether to say what they saw. What, he said. She nodded toward one of the secondary screens, where a camera feed from a different angle was showing the stern section of the vessel. Look at the stern, the upper section. Tell me what you see. He looked. It took him a moment, because his brain kept trying to fit what he was seeing into categories it had, kept trying to find the familiar shape under the unfamiliar context. Then it clicked, the way those visual puzzles click when you finally see the hidden image and cannot unsee it afterward. There were markings on the stern. Not erosion patterns. Not the random geometry of mineral deposition or biological growth. Markings. Deliberate, structured, repeating with the regularity of language, carved or inscribed or somehow embedded into the hull material in patterns that is pattern recognition. The deep instinctive pattern recognition that had spent 23 years studying ancient scripts and symbols, and the ways that human beings had recorded meaning across millennia, was insisting were linguistic. He had seen every known ancient script on Earth. He had never seen anything that looked like this. Get the ROV over to the stern section, he said. His voice was steady. He was proud of that. Full resolution imaging on those markings, every angle. The ROV moved. The cameras captured. The images came back crisp and clear and completely, utterly unprecedented. 3 hours later, Marcus was alone in a small conference room on the Athena with a laptop covered in zoomed-in images of the markings and a cold cup of coffee, and the specific feeling of a man who has spent his entire professional life devoted to a question and has just received an answer that is both everything he wanted and nothing he was prepared for. The markings were not random. He was certain of that within the first 20 minutes. The structural regularity was too consistent, the repetition patterns too organized, the variation within repetition too controlled. This was language. He was as certain of that as he had ever been of anything in 23 years of academic work. It was not any human language. He was certain of that too. He had run comparisons against every known ancient script in the database he carried. Proto-Sinaitic, Linear A, Linear B, Sumerian cuneiform, Proto-Elamite, the Indus Valley script, the Vinci symbols, Rongorongo, every undeciphered script, every known script, every transitional form between them. The comparison software had come back with correlation scores so low they were essentially zero, not low like a distant linguistic relative, low like a different family. low like something that had developed entirely separately from every other writing system ever found on this planet. His phone was ringing. He had been ignoring it for 2 hours. He looked at it now. Yolanda 3 times, Chen Wei twice, Commander Tors once, which was 1 time more than Marcus was comfortable with. He answered Yolanda. "We need to talk," she said immediately. "Chen's preliminary surface analysis is back, the non-invasive spectroscopy." And a pause. "The hull material contains elements in ratios and configurations that are Marcus." Chen's exact words were that the material composition is inconsistent with any natural geological process on Earth. His words. Inconsistent with any natural geological process on Earth. Marcus sat with that. "He thinks it's manufactured," Yolanda continued. "Engineered at a molecular level. The kind of material engineering that implies a manufacturing process that we do not currently have, and that," she stopped, started again. "That would require an understanding of material science that our civilization does not currently possess." 5,000 years ago, Marcus said. "Or," Yolanda said carefully, "not 5,000 years ago. The sediment dating tells us when it was deposited. It doesn't tell us when it was built." Marcus stood up slowly. He walked to the small porthole in the conference room wall and looked out at the ocean. Somewhere 11,000 feet below the surface of that water, an 800-foot vessel was sitting on the seabed with hull markings in a non-human language and hull material that human civilization could not currently manufacture. And it had been there for at least 5,000 years, and it was sitting upright, and it looked new. Something was wrong, he said quietly, not to Yolanda, to himself. The thing he had felt from the first moment, the flat, certain wrongness that had preceded the wonder, coming back now with a different weight. "Marcus," Yolanda said, "there's something else." He waited. "The ROV did a full external survey while you were in the conference room. Chen and I have been going through the footage." Another pause, and this pause had something in it that he had never heard in Yolanda's voice in 18 years of friendship and professional collaboration. Something careful and large. "Marcus, the vessel has a hull breach. Midships port side about 40 feet above the keel. It looks like impact damage. Something hit it very hard from the outside." "That would explain why it sank," Marcus said. "Yes," Yolanda said. "But the breach pattern." Chen analyzed the material deformation around the edges of the breach, the way the hull material failed, the direction and force of the impact. She stopped. "Yolanda." "The impact came from inside," she said. "Something hit that hull from the inside, hard enough to breach it, hard enough to sink an 800-foot vessel." Marcus turned away from the porthole. "We need to go inside," he said. The internal survey took 4 days to prepare and 6 hours to execute. The ROV, modified with additional lighting and a more maneuverable thruster configuration, went in through the hull breach at the start of the 3rd week and spent 6 hours moving through the interior of a vessel that had been sealed and dark and waiting at the bottom of the ocean for 5 millennia. Marcus watched every minute of the footage live, and then watched it again, and then sat for a long time not watching anything. The interior was intact, compartmentalized like a warship, with bulkheads and pressure doors and spatial organization that implied military function as clearly as any modern naval vessel. The hull material was consistent throughout. The markings were everywhere inside, covering walls and surfaces and structural elements in dense, organized patterns that were going to take years to analyze and would probably occupy linguistic researchers for a generation. There were no bodies. That was the first significant thing. Whatever crew had operated this vessel, and it had clearly been crewed, the spatial organization, the evident purpose of different compartments, the equipment mounts, all of it implied a crew of significant size, but there were no remains. No bodies, no preserved organic material of any kind that the ROV sensors could detect. Either the crew had survived whatever sank the ship, or they had been removed, or something had happened to them that left no trace. The second significant thing was in the central compartment, what the team had started calling the bridge, the largest enclosed space in the forward section of the vessel, with the densest concentration of equipment mounts, and what appeared to be interface surfaces of some kind, screens or displays, or something functionally analogous to those things. In the center of the bridge, bolted to the deck with hardware that had not corroded even slightly in 5,000 years of ocean submersion, was a container. Rectangular, about the size of a large suitcase, made of the same black iridescent hull material, covered in markings. It was sealed. The ROV could not open it. It was not clear if the ROV could have opened it even if it had been designed to try. Chen Wei looked at the container on the screen and said, very quietly, "That was placed there deliberately, after the ship was already sinking. Look at the mounting hardware. Those bolts were driven after the hull breach. The torque marks are on top of water damage to the deck plating, not under it." Marcus looked at the torque marks. Chen was right. Someone had bolted that container to the deck of a sinking ship that was already taking on water. Someone had wanted to make sure it stayed there. Someone had wanted to make sure it was found. He sat with that thought for a long time, the size of it, the weight of it. Whatever was in that container had been placed there by something, 5,000 years ago, on a vessel whose hull material human civilization could not currently replicate, with a written language that had no relationship to any human script, and it had been bolted to the deck of that vessel as it sank into 11,000 feet of water, and the person or thing that bolted it there had done so knowing, had to have known, that it would stay there until someone came for it. Until someone was capable of coming for it. He thought about the sediment layer. 5,000 years. He thought about where humanity had been 5,000 years ago and where humanity was now, and he thought about the gap between those 2 points, and he thought about what kind of being would look at that gap and decide to wait. The retrieval operation took another 3 weeks to plan. The Navy, which had stopped pretending to be a casual observer somewhere around day 6, was now a full participant, bringing in specialized deep recovery equipment that Marcus was fairly sure was not listed in any public procurement database. Commander Tors, in a conversation that was notably more candid than any of the previous ones, told Marcus that the analysis of the ROV footage had been shared with several agencies, that those agencies had shared it further up various chains of command, and that the general consensus at levels Marcus was not cleared for was that the container needed to come up and come up carefully. "We don't know what's in it," Tors said. "No," Marcus agreed. "It could be anything." "Yes." Tors was quiet for a moment. "Does that scare you?" Marcus thought about it honestly. He thought about 23 years of work, built on the assumption that the history of human civilization was a story that began in certain places at certain times and progressed in certain directions. He thought about everything that container might mean if it contained what the evidence suggested it might contain: a message, a record, a whatever the equivalent word was for a communication left by something that was not human and was not from this planet, sitting in a sinking ship 5,000 years ago waiting for whoever could eventually get down there to retrieve it. "No," he said, and meant it. "It means we're not the first. That's not scary. That's the most important thing our species has ever learned." Tors looked at him for a moment. "And if what's inside tells us something we're not ready for?" Marcus almost smiled. "We've never been ready for anything. We do it anyway. That's kind of our whole thing." The container came up on a Thursday morning, in a specialized recovery vessel surrounded by Navy ships and research vessels, and one very small and slightly battered research vessel, called the Meridian, that had absolutely no reason to still be here, except that Marcus Webb was on it, and he was not leaving. It sat in a sealed environment chamber, surrounded by sensor arrays and cameras, and people who had spent their careers preparing for this moment, and were now very still and very quiet in the face of it. The analysis team worked on the seal mechanism for 6 days before it opened, not because the mechanism was damaged, because it was designed to open only under specific conditions, conditions that took 6 days to understand and reproduce. Conditions, the engineering team noted with the particular tone of people trying to stay clinical about something that was not remotely clinical, that were specifically calibrated to technology that did not exist when the container was sealed. Technology that had existed, roughly, for about 40 years. The container had been waiting for them to be ready for it. Inside was a single object, a data storage medium of a type that took 3 months to develop a reader for, and when the reader worked, it delivered not raw data but something structured, organized, and unmistakably intentional. A record, a history, written in a language that, once the translation architecture was understood, which itself took 8 months, and the combined effort of every computational linguist the consortium could assemble, proved to be not a foreign language at all but something closer to a root, a linguistic foundation from which, over 5,000 years of separation and development and drift, every major language family on Earth had descended. The history it contained was long. It was detailed. It was, in the careful measured assessment of the 37 researchers who spent 2 years translating and analyzing it, completely consistent with every piece of physical and archaeological evidence humanity had accumulated about its own past, except that it explained things that had never been explained, connected things that had never been connected, and answered questions that the field had been arguing about for a century. And it began with a departure. A people, it said, in the careful considered translation that the team agreed was as accurate as their understanding allowed, had come here, had found this world young and rich and alive, had decided to stay, had changed over generations in ways that the people who came after them would call evolution, and the people who had come before would recognize as the same change they had made in other places under other suns. Had become, slowly and thoroughly and without ever knowing it, the people who were reading these words now. The container held one other thing. Beneath the data medium in a fitted recess, a small device that the engineering team spent 6 weeks analyzing. It was a transmitter, old by any measure, but the engineering team's assessment, delivered in the tone of people who have stopped being surprised by things and are simply documenting them, was that with a power source and a specific activation sequence, it would function. It was pointed, they said, at a particular region of space, a particular star system, roughly 12 light-years from Earth, a sun slightly smaller than ours, slightly cooler, with a planetary system that humanity had catalogued and observed and noted as potentially interesting, and never had the capability to meaningfully investigate. Until recently. The team put the question to Marcus, because it was his project, because he had found it, because after 3 years of this particular journey someone had decided he had earned the right to be the one to answer the hardest question. Do you want to turn it on? Marcus Webb sat in the analysis lab with the transmitter in front of him and thought about everything he knew about humanity. The stumbling, arguing, brilliant, stubborn, creative, occasionally catastrophic enterprise of being human, spread across this small planet over a handful of millennia, never knowing, never even suspecting, that the first word of their story had been written somewhere else. He thought about what it meant to send a signal, about what might answer. He thought about what Commander Torres had asked him, months ago, on a different ship, looking at a container on the floor of the ocean. What if it tells us something we're not ready for? We've never been ready for anything. We do it anyway. He turned it on. The signal went out at the speed of light toward a small, cool star 12 light-years away, carrying a message that the translation team had found encoded into the transmitter's activation sequence, a message that had been waiting in that device for 5,000 years, pointing at that star, waiting for the moment when the people who found it were capable of sending it. The message was 11 words in the root language, which translated to 9 words in English. We are still here. We became something wonderful. Come see. Marcus sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and thought about 12 years, the time it would take the signal to arrive, the time it would take any answer to come back. 24 years minimum of waiting. He was 51 years old. He might be alive to hear the answer. He might not. He found, somewhat to his own surprise, that this was all right. The universe was very large and very old and apparently quite thoroughly populated with things that were patient and intentional and willing to wait. Humanity had been waiting, without knowing it, for 5,000 years to find this message. The least they could do was wait 24 more. Beside him, Yolanda was looking at the transmitter with the expression he had learned, over 18 years, to recognize as her thinking face. The one that meant she was turning something over and over until she found the angle that satisfied her. "Marcus," she said. "Yeah, we should call our families." He looked at her. "It's been 3 years," she said simply, "and we just changed everything. We should call our families and tell them we're okay and then sleep for about a week." She paused. "And then we should probably figure out what we're going to say to the rest of the planet." He laughed. It surprised him. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes from the part of a person that exists before professionalism and after shock, the pure human part that finds release in the absurdity of things, in the gap between the scale of events and the smallness of the people inside them. They called their families. They slept. They ate food that was not from a research vessel cafeteria for the first time in longer than either of them wanted to calculate. And then they wrote the paper that would be downloaded 4 billion times in its first 48 hours of publication, and would be the subject of more discussion, debate, joy, terror, wonder, and philosophical upheaval than any document in recorded human history. The wreck should not have been there. That was still the first thing Marcus thought about it. Even now, even knowing what he knew, the thought remained. The wreck should not have been there by any logic, by any model of the universe he had held before 3 years ago. It violated his categories. It broke his frameworks. It sat in the deep, dark water for 5,000 years and waited for him to find it and shatter every assumption he had ever made about what humanity was and where it came from and what that meant for where it was going. He would not have had it any other way. 12 light-years away, a small, cool star shone in the dark. It had been shining for a long time. It would shine for a long time yet. And now it was waiting for an answer. The end.